The moment I knew something was deeply wrong wasn't when my father died. It wasn't when my brother showed up to the reading of the will in a brand new suit, looking less like a grieving son and more like a man closing a business deal he'd been waiting years to finalize. It wasn't even when he slammed both palms flat on the conference table and said, and I remember every single word, "This isn't what we agreed. He promised me everything." The moment I knew something was wrong was when the lawyer calmly reached beneath the table, placed a sealed white envelope directly in front of my brother, and said, "Mr. Ethan, before you continue, there's something you need to understand about your father's final instructions." The room went completely still. Ethan's jaw tightened, and I watched something cross my brother's face that I had never once seen there before. It wasn't anger. It was fear. That was 6 weeks ago! And what was inside that envelope changed everything I thought I knew, about my family, about my father, and about the man who had been living under our roof for the first 22 years of my life. If you're new here, I share stories that most families never talk about out loud. If any of this sounds familiar to something you've lived through, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. I promise, this one goes somewhere you will not see coming. Let me back up. My father, Thomas, was not a complicated man. At least, that's what I believed for most of my life. He ran a hardware supply business for 34 years. Nothing glamorous. He woke up at 5:30 every morning, drove a truck that was 12 years old, and never once talked about money at the dinner table. He always said that was bad manners. Mom passed when I was 15. After that, it was just Dad, my brother Ethan, and me. Ethan is 6 years older. By the time I was in high school, he'd already taken a position inside Dad's business, which was exactly what my father had always hoped for. Dad talked about it like it was a legacy. "One day, this all continues through you," he'd say to Ethan at dinner, and Ethan would nod like he already knew it. I went a different direction. I finished college, became a physical therapist, and moved about 2 hours away. I visited every couple of months, called every Sunday. But Ethan stayed close. He worked alongside my father daily. He was there for everything. The slow seasons, the late nights, the years when the business barely broke even. And I gave him a lot of credit for that. Looking back, that might have been my first mistake, confusing proximity with loyalty. Because being physically present in someone's life and actually caring about that person are two completely different things. I didn't see that clearly until it was almost too late. My father had a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in late October. He was 67 years old, healthy by most measures, still going into the office 3 days a week, still fixing things around the house on weekends. The neighbor found him in the driveway. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The call came from Ethan. He was composed, oddly composed, but I told myself that people grieve differently, and I didn't let myself sit with that feeling. I drove the 2 hours to the family home that evening, shaking the entire way. What I did not expect was to walk through the front door and find Ethan already sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of him, covered in handwritten notes. I remember thinking it was strange, but I was in shock. I told myself it was just him being practical, being organized, processing through logistics the way some people do. I dismissed it. That night, while I was in my childhood bedroom trying to understand that both my parents were gone now, I heard Ethan on the phone in the hallway. I caught just one phrase through the wall. The business assets and the property holdings. I told myself he was talking to an insurance company, or an estate attorney, something practical, something necessary. I told myself a lot of things that week. The first real warning came 2 days after the funeral. Ethan called and said, "We need to talk about the estate before things get complicated." I said, "We haven't buried him a week, Ethan." He said, "That's exactly why we need to move fast." Move fast. That phrase settled in my stomach like something cold, and I couldn't shake it. The will reading was scheduled 3 weeks after Dad passed. The attorney was a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had handled my father's affairs for over 2 decades. I'd met him once at a Christmas party years ago, a quiet, careful man who chose his words like he was paying for each one. Ethan showed up with his own attorney. That was the first thing that surprised me. You don't bring legal representation to a will reading unless you're already planning to challenge what's in it. The will itself seemed straightforward enough on the surface. The family home, the business, the savings accounts, Everything split equally, 50-50 between the two of us. That's when Ethan lost it. His voice stayed controlled, tight, like something wound too hard, but his composure cracked around the edges. That's not what he told me. He told me the business was mine, entirely. We had an agreement. Gerald Pruitt looked at him without any particular expression and said, "The document before you is your father's final, legally executed will, signed 14 months ago." Ethan's attorney leaned over and whispered something. Ethan nodded once. "We'll be contesting this," Ethan said. "There are grounds." I looked at my brother across that table, and I realized something that knocked the air out of me quietly, like a door shutting in a room far away. He wasn't upset because he was grieving. He wasn't even upset because he thought the split was unfair. He was upset because something had not gone according to a plan. I just didn't know whose plan yet, or how long it had been running, but I was about to find out. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into understanding the estate. Partly because Ethan's legal challenge forced me to, and partly because something in my gut refused to settle. The business valuation came back lower than I expected. Significantly lower. The hardware supply company my father had operated for over 30 years was worth considerably less than it should have been. Less than the equipment inside it, practically. I mentioned this to a friend whose husband worked in finance. She suggested I look at the business's cash flow statements from the last several years, not just the static valuation. I requested them through Gerald Pruitt's office. What I saw made my mouth go dry. Over the past 4 years, the business had been running at a consistent loss. Inventory purchases that didn't match any corresponding sales records, vendor payments to companies I could find no trace of in any public database. Funds routed through an operating account with a name I didn't recognize at all. I called Ethan. I kept my voice completely level. "Hey, I was looking at some of the business finances. There are a few vendor accounts I can't find any records for. Can you walk me through those?" There was a pause on his end, half a second too long. "Those are just operational suppliers. Nothing unusual. I'll walk you through it sometime." He never walked me through it. That sometime never came. And looking back, I understand now. That was the exact moment I stopped being his grieving sister to him. I became something he needed to manage. Something that had gotten too close. 3 weeks after the will reading, I got a call from a man I had never heard of. He said his name was Dennis Ware, and that he had been my father's financial advisor for the past 11 years. I sat very still when he said that. Because nobody had mentioned a financial advisor. Not Ethan, not Gerald Pruitt, not anyone. Dennis told me he'd been instructed by my father not to make contact until 30 days after the death. He said my father had been very specific about that timing. I asked him why. He said, "I think your father knew that certain things would need to settle before the full picture could be seen safely." Safely. I asked him what he meant by that. A pause. Not evasive, but careful. Like someone selecting exactly the right word from a shelf full of wrong ones. "Your father came to me 11 years ago with concerns about activity in the business accounts. He asked me to help him quietly separate certain personal assets, legally and completely, from the business structure. Over time, that became something considerably larger." I asked him how considerably larger. He said, "I think we should meet in person." We met the following Tuesday at a quiet restaurant 40 minutes from my home. Dennis was in his late 50s, soft-spoken, the kind of man who seemed genuinely allergic to anything unnecessary. He brought a folder. Inside was a summary. Just a summary, he was careful to clarify, of what my father had quietly accumulated over 11 years of deliberate, methodical financial repositioning. I stared at the number at the bottom of that page for a very long time. It was not the estate of a modest hardware store owner. Not even close. I drove home from that meeting in a kind of suspended silence. My father, the man who drove a 12-year-old truck and believed that talking about money at dinner was bad manners, had quietly built something extraordinary over more than a decade, and he had kept it almost entirely hidden. Not from everyone. From Ethan specifically. Dennis explained it carefully. About 8 years ago, my father had discovered that money was being siphoned from the business, small amounts at first, then larger. He hired an independent forensic accountant, privately, without telling a soul, who confirmed exactly what he'd feared. The money was being routed to accounts that traced back to my brother. My father didn't confront Ethan. He didn't call the police. He didn't threaten. He didn't yell. He just started quietly moving. He restructured his personal assets, opened accounts in his name only, through Dennis, began redirecting everything that mattered, everything real, away from anything Ethan could access or contest. And he said absolutely nothing. For years. I asked Dennis why my father had never reported it. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he told me once that Ethan was still his son, that he hoped he was wrong, that he wanted to give him every possible chance to turn around. I had to look out the window for a while. Because I understood that. I understood it at a level that went straight to the bone. But then Dennis told me the part that changed everything. He said my father had known in his final year that his heart condition was getting worse. He'd been quietly preparing for it. He had arranged for a sealed envelope, entirely separate from the will, to be held by a third-party attorney, not Gerald Pruitt, someone neither Ethan nor I had ever heard of, to be delivered 30 days after his death, to the will reading. My father had planned this with extraordinary care, and then I remembered the moment in that conference room, the lawyer reaching beneath the table, the sealed white envelope, and the thing that crossed my brother's face. That wasn't the first time Ethan had heard about that envelope. I was sure of it. That realization stayed with me for 2 full days before I acted on it. If Ethan had known the envelope existed, even generally, even as a rumor, then every move he'd made since our father died looked completely different. The legal pad on the night he died. We need to move fast. His own attorney at the will reading. The immediate challenge. He wasn't reacting to the will. He was trying to neutralize something before it could surface. I called Dennis back and asked one direct question. Did Ethan know about the separate assets? Dennis said, we believe he suspected there were assets he couldn't locate, but he didn't know the specifics. Your father was very careful about that. I asked about the envelope. I don't know the exact contents, only your father did, but he told me it contained documentation that would make everything clear. I asked who was holding it. Dennis gave me a name. An attorney in the city, a woman named Carol Bassett, who specialized in estate planning and asset protection. I called her office the next morning. She confirmed she had the envelope. She confirmed it was to be presented at a formal meeting, and that the meeting needed to include both beneficiaries. Both of us. That meant Ethan had to be in the room when it was opened. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that he would do everything he could to keep that from happening. I'm going to be honest with you. I almost didn't go through with it. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because part of me still wanted to find an innocent version of the story somewhere. Some explanation I hadn't thought of, some error in the accounting, some misunderstanding that would mean my brother was still the person I had grown up believing he was. I called Ethan, kept it simple, told him Carol Bassett's office had reached out, that there was a separate piece of the estate process requiring both of us to be present, and that I'd forwarded the meeting details. Silence on his end. Then, who is Carol Bassett? She handled some of Dad's final estate planning. He set this up separately, apparently. Another silence, longer. I'll have my attorney review it. Of course, I said. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already met with Dennis Ware, that I'd already requested copies of the forensic accounting from 11 years ago through a legal channel he couldn't block, that Gerald Pruitt, the original estate attorney, had quietly agreed to also be present at the Carol Bassett meeting. Because my father had left instructions for that too. He had thought of almost everything. Almost. What he couldn't predict was how desperate Ethan would get in the 72 hours before that meeting. 2 nights before Thursday, I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end said, "If you proceed with that meeting, understand you'll be opening up a lot of things that will embarrass your father's memory. Think carefully about whether that's what he would have wanted." Then, they hung up. I sat with my phone in my hand for a full minute. Then, I texted Carol Bassett, Dennis Ware, and Gerald Pruitt one message. Still on. See you Thursday. The Thursday meeting was held in Carol Bassett's conference room. Smaller than Gerald Pruitt's office, quieter. A long table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked out over a concrete parking structure going gray in the morning light. Ethan arrived 7 minutes late with his attorney, a younger man named Reed, who carried himself with the practiced calm of someone who had been told to look unintimidated and was working hard at it. Carol Bassett waited until everyone was seated. She didn't rush. She arranged 2 documents in front of her with the particular patience of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it ends. Then she placed the envelope on the table. A standard business envelope, sealed with wax, old-fashioned, which was so completely my father that I nearly smiled at it. His name was written on the back flap in his own handwriting. On the front, just one name. Mine. Not Ethan's, just mine. I watched my brother's face when he registered that. Reed immediately said, "We'd like to note for the record that any document addressed exclusively to one beneficiary cannot be unilaterally." Carol Bassett said, calmly and without looking up, "The envelope is addressed to your client's sister. However, your father's instructions, which are fully documented and registered, specify that it is to be opened in the presence of both parties. He wanted his son to hear what it contains. Hear it. Not receive it. Not benefit from it. Hear it." Reed glanced at Ethan. Ethan gave one short nod. Carol Bassett slid the envelope across to me. My hands were completely steady, which genuinely surprised me. I did not feel steady inside, but my hands were. I broke the wax seal. Inside were 3 things. A handwritten letter, 6 pages, a small USB drive, and a printed financial summary, the same document Dennis had shown me, but with a second page attached that I hadn't seen before. Carol Bassett said, "Your father asked that the letter be read aloud." I looked at his handwriting. The slant of it, the way he always pressed slightly too hard with the pen, handwriting I had known my entire life. And I started reading. My father's letter began simply, "If you're reading this, then I've already gone, and I want you to know I made my peace with that. What I couldn't make peace with was leaving you without the truth." He wrote about the business. About discovering, 8 years ago, that accounting irregularities he'd first assumed were clerical errors were not errors at all. About the private forensic accountant. About the documented transfers, over $340,000, moved from business accounts to shell accounts that traced directly back to Ethan. He wrote about why he had never confronted his son. I kept thinking he would stop, that whatever debt or pressure he was under, he would come to me eventually. I waited. He never came. And somewhere in that waiting I understood that he was not going to stop, and that he never had any intention to. He wrote about Dennis Ware, about 11 years of quiet, deliberate repositioning, properties purchased in different states through a holding structure, investment accounts, an insurance policy structured specifically to pass outside of probate, untouchable by any contested will process. And then he wrote about the USB drive. It contained every document, the complete forensic accounting report, records of every shell account, bank statements, wire transfers with Ethan's name running through them like a thread. My father had kept records of everything, for years. He had built his case in silence, file by file, year by year. Ethan's attorney said something under his breath that I didn't catch. Ethan had gone completely still beside him, not the stillness of someone thinking, but the stillness of someone who has just watched the last exit close behind them. The second page of the financial summary, the one Dennis had added, showed the total value of my father's separate estate. Not the business, not the family home. The assets he had built and protected over 11 years of deliberate, quiet, patient work. The number was more than I could have imagined, multiple times more than the estate we had spent weeks arguing over. And my father's letter ended with this: "I'm not giving you this because I was clever. I'm giving it to you because I want you to know that I saw everything clearly, and I refused to let it win quietly. I'm sorry I never told you while I was still there. I was trying to protect you from having to choose sides while I could still be between you. I hope you can understand that. I hope you can forgive it." I got to the last line and had to stop reading for a moment. Carol Bassett let the silence hold. When I looked up, Ethan was staring at the table. His attorney was typing rapidly on his phone. Gerald Pruitt sat with his hands folded, watching nothing in particular. And I felt something I had not expected to feel in that room. Not triumph, not relief. Just grief. Grief for my father, who had carried the weight of knowing for nearly a decade, alone. Grief for a brother I had lost long before that morning. Lost slowly, in increments, During all those years, I'd been 2 hours away calling every Sunday, convinced everything was fine. That's when Ethan finally spoke. He looked directly at me, not at Carol Bassett, not at Gerald Pruitt, directly at me. And he said, "I needed it more than you did. You always had everything figured out." I looked back at him for a long moment. Then I said, "You had the same thing I did, Ethan. You just wanted more than your share of it." He didn't say anything else. Reed said they had matters to review privately. They gathered their things and left without another word. The door closed, and the room was very quiet. I know a lot of you right now are asking yourselves what you would have done in that room, whether you would have said more or said nothing at all, whether you would have confronted this years earlier or walked away entirely. Drop that in the comments. I genuinely want to know, because I have asked myself those exact questions more times than I can count. What followed was not fast. And it was not satisfying in the way movies make you expect justice to be satisfying. Ethan's legal challenge to the original will collapsed within 2 weeks of that meeting, once Carol Bassett's documentation entered the formal record. There was simply nothing left to build a challenge on. The forensic accounting report was referred to the state attorney's office. An investigation was formally opened. Ethan's attorney negotiated aggressively, as attorneys do. Ultimately, Ethan did not face criminal prosecution. He agreed to a full restitution arrangement and a civil judgment that attached to him for years going forward. The business, which he had been slowly hollowing out for nearly a decade, was sold. His portion of the proceeds went directly into the restitution agreement, nearly in full. My father's separate estate, the one built through 11 years of quiet, careful work, passed to me exactly as he had intended, entirely outside the contested probate process, untouchable by any challenge Ethan had filed or could file. I spent a long time not knowing how to hold all of that. I had financial security I had never expected to have. I also had a brother who had looked me in the eye and implied that his theft was somehow a response to something I had taken from him, as though that justified years of draining the father who had loved him and waited patiently and stayed silent, hoping that silence would be enough space for his son to find his way back. He never found his way back. That was the part that didn't resolve cleanly. The money resolved, the legal process resolved, but the understanding that my father had spent the final decade of his life waiting for a moment that was never going to come, that part doesn't have a clean ending. I kept the letter, all 6 handwritten pages, in a frame on the wall of my home office, not to remind myself of the pain inside it, but because of the last line. He said he hoped I could forgive him for trying to protect me from having to choose sides while he was still alive. I have thought about that sentence hundreds of times, because I understand it now in a way I couldn't have before I opened that envelope. He was protecting me. He was carrying something vast, the knowledge of what his son had done, the grief of it, the patience of it, and he carried it entirely alone so that I would not have to. So that my relationship with my brother, however fractured it already was, could survive just a little longer. That was my father. Quiet, deliberate, and fundamentally decent, even when the people he loved most were not being decent in return. I'm not going to tell you I've healed completely. Grief doesn't move in straight lines, and the specific hurt that comes from learning your family held secrets this large, that takes time to metabolize in ways that therapy books don't fully explain. But here is what I will tell you. I found out who my father actually was. Not a smaller version of what I'd believed, but a much larger one. He wasn't just a man who woke up early and drove a truck that was 12 years old. He was someone who spent a decade quietly outmaneuvering betrayal, not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but out of a stubborn, patient love that refused to let the wrong person win. He didn't fight back loudly. He just made absolutely certain that the truth would eventually land exactly where it needed to. That sealed envelope was his voice from every moment he had chosen silence. And I heard him, loud and clear. If you've ever had someone in your family try to take something from you, financially, emotionally, or in any other way, your story deserves to be heard too. Leave it in the comments. This community is made up of real people who have lived through real things, and every story shared here reminds someone else that they are not alone. If this story moved you in any way, please subscribe. I'm here every week with stories that most people only tell behind closed doors. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. That means more than I can properly say. There's another story waiting for you right now when you're ready. I'll see you there.